country, and we're getting reports that the shooting yesterday on a funeral procession that was passing by a government compound came under fire from security forces who were wearing yellow berets, and it looks as if also the Libyan government is deploying some of its elite forces to the region of eastern Libya with, according to reports, commanded by some of the top figures in the regime, including Colonel Gaddafi's son.
All right, one of the sons, anyway. Is it likely, do you think, that anyone is going to be held responsible or accountable for firing on protesters, which must be an illegal? It's sheer murder.
It's almost certain, from what we can gather, that the crackdown involves unlawful acts, unlawful shooting on people who are just coming out into the streets to demand their rights to peaceful protest. I think whether people are held accountable depends on what happens politically in the next few weeks. But certainly the European Union and other international actors should be reminding the Libyan authorities that there should be accountability under international law for these violations of international human rights law.
Well, Washington has already spoken today, warning about firing on unarmed protesters. But is there any more the international community could do at this stage? We're only 3-4 days in. Is it too early to expect any significant reaction internationally?
Well, I think there's been quite a strong reaction, for example, from the UK Foreign Minister in the last 24 hours. I think we can expect a very strong reaction from the EU. But the problem is that unlike Egypt or Tunisia or Bahrain, Libya is only a rather new friend of the West. It was brought in from the cold, as it were, where Colonel Gaddafi was rehabilitated after spending decades, considered as an international pariah. And one of the problems, of course, with that rehabilitation was that the European Union was very keen on strategic cooperation on counterterrorism, cooperation on immigration and commercial relations, but not very much was said about human rights. And now that failure, I think, is going to come back to haunt the European Union.
And it's a failure of diplomacy. I mean, it's simple. I mean, it's been one of the most repressive regimes in the Maghreb.
Exactly, and I think people will look back and see that the European Union did fail in Libya in not putting human rights firmly on the agenda. And in fact, this is the pattern that we're seeing that is playing itself out throughout the Middle East at the moment, where it turns out that the West has had very cozy relationships with repressive regimes for a very long time, and now they're having to play catch-up because it's quite clear now with what's happening throughout the region that the policy of relying on repressive governments for stability and for securing strategic and commercial interests, that policy has passed its sell-by date. And the European Union and other democratic governments around the world really need to get behind this clear demand, which is coming from the people of the region, for a real change from repression to democracy underpinned by the rule of law and respect for human rights.
All right, Tom, we'll leave it there. Tom Porteous from Human Rights Watch, thank you. Well, as I just mentioned, the United States says it's gravely concerned by the reports of deaths in Libya, and it's warned Americans to delay travel to the country. Meanwhile, the United Nations has defended its relationship with Libya and its spot on the Human Rights Council.
And they have been trying to get in to look at human rights issues in Libya over a long period of time, and they have not been allowed access. And this is what I think people need to understand. The United Nations is made up of its member states. Libya was voted on to the United Nations Human Rights Council, so if there are concerns about Libya being a member of that council, it's for the other member states to recognise that and to vote them off.
Well, Libya is just one country caught up in the wave of unrest sweeping across the Maghreb. As you can see here, the protests that began in Tunisia and Algeria before moving to Egypt have now engulfed many countries in the region. Well, earlier, 2,000 people gathered in Morocco's capital, Rabat, demanding that King Mohammed give up some of his powers. They also want him to clamp down on government corruption. In Djibouti, protesters have clashed with police this weekend as they called on their president to step down. Unemployment in the tiny Horn of Africa state stands currently at about 60%. In Iran, the daughter of a former president, Rafsanjani, was arrested and later released for attending one of several banned opposition rallies. And in Yemen, pro- and anti-government troops have thrown stones at each other during these disturbances on what is effectively now the 9th day of action, urging President Saleh to quit. He, meanwhile, has appeared before thousands of cheering supporters in the capital. Hashim Al-Habara has more from Sana'a.
A show of support for President Saleh. Loyalists waving flags and chanting slogans in praise for a man they describe as their glorious leader and the hope of Yemen. This is his first gathering with supporters, party stalwarts and tribal leaders. A message that he is also capable of rallying support to counter the pro-reform momentum.
If the demands of the protesters are legitimate, we are ready to listen to their demands. We have to assume our responsibilities and courageously seek dialogue. It is the best way, not destruction or blocking the roads or killing people or targeting public and private properties.
These tribesmen are Saleh's potential weapon in case the crisis in his country reaches the point of no return and the streets are overwhelmed by his opponents.
Loyalty of the tribal leaders has always been instrumental in maintaining President Saleh's grip on power. But whether they will this time help him weather the storm remains to be seen.
Crowds massing outside the University of Sana'a, performing midday prayers. These are the driving force of the pro-reform movement. Thousands of students spearheading calls for regime change. The demonstrators are planning to camp out here until their demands for radical reform are met. In other parts of the country, anti-government demonstrations are also continuing. Here in the city of Taiz, the atmosphere is electric. Thousands are converging on the main streets, calling for change.
I'm afraid that there is the possibility of civil war if people do not act wisely. President Saleh is being invited by everyone, including the opposition, to lead that change and remain president. If that does not happen under his stewardship, it may happen without him.
The seismic impact of the revolutions that swept Tunisia and Egypt are clearly felt in Yemen. A veteran leader clinging to power and a younger generation of reform activists determined to keep fighting for change. Hashim Al-Habara, AlJazeera, Sana'a.
Protesters in Bahrain are digging their heels in, setting up camp in the capital, Manama. Hundreds of people spent the night in Pearl Square after the government ordered the military to pull out. Several demonstrators were killed during Thursday's protests. Opposition supporters say their demands must be met before there can be more dialogue with the royal family. James Bays is there, and he told me the protesters are not interested in a dialogue with the government.
We want the government removed, and we